Hello, I'm Rob, and welcome to Alternatives To, where we look at an upcoming video game and suggest some alternatives that you can play in addition to, instead of, or even alongside the game that's coming out. Now, our suggestions might be obvious, or they might be a bit left field. It all depends on the game. In this episode, we're looking at The Medium, which is developed by Bloober Team and published by them as well, and that's coming out in just a few days. That looks really interesting. We'll get into that in a second, but before we go any further, I should point out that this is not a review. I repeat, this is not a review. So, what is The Medium? Well, The Medium is a third-person psychological horror game that's set in Krakow in Poland. You play as a particular medium called Marianne, and she is being haunted by visions. And so she decides to go to an abandoned hotel in Krakow where she discovers various mysteries that suggest something terrible has happened in the hotel. And it's up to Marianne to discover what has happened and who's responsible. So, nice and straightforward, but given that Bloober Team are really big fans of the Silent Hill franchise, you can see a lot of the influence of Silent Hill in what's been shown of The Medium. Now, there is gameplay footage, there are trailers for the game. You can see the echoes of Silent Hill. One of the things that stands out about the game in particular is the split screen. What Bloober Team have done, and this is really interesting the way they've approached this game, they've tried to highlight the difference in how Marianne sees the world as a spirit medium, because mediums by their nature will see things other people don't. And in this case, you will see Marianne in the real world, but you'll also see Marianne in the spirit world. On both sides of the screen, Marianne will be moving in exactly the same way, but on one side of the screen, Marianne might be interacting with something in the real world, and in the spirit world, it looks like she's not interacting with anything. She's making the movements, the actions, but there's nothing there, and vice versa. The split screen effect is a really interesting way of approaching this whole idea of communicating with the spirit world and existing in the real world at the same time. It reminds me a little bit of games like Degrees of Separation and maybe even A Fold Apart. The game does have puzzle solving elements along with action elements as well, but I think it's more strongly leaning towards the puzzle elements from what we've seen of the gameplay. And in a sense, it kind of reminds me of games like Haunting Ground as well. But we're not here to talk about those, and I did mention Silent Hill. Silent Hill is an obvious choice to go alongside The Medium, which is why it's not on this list, so I'm just getting that out there. For my first trick, I've gone with something just as colourful as Degrees of Separation and A Fold Apart, but also very different. My first alternative to The Medium is a game that came out in 2019 on the PC, on the Switch and the PS4, and it's developed by Spike Chunsoft. It's AI, The Somnium Files. Now, I know some people pronounce it as I, and I know that on the Wikipedia page it's even pronounced I, and it relates to the fact that the main character has an artificial intelligence in his left eye, which those of you who are old enough to remember a manga and anime series, a really awful manga and anime series from the 90s called Goku Midnight Eye. I even cringe saying the words. Don't watch it. Anyway, it is basically a murder mystery investigation game, and it's set in a technologically advanced near-future Tokyo. The game follows Special Agent Kaname Date, who is part of the top-secret police department called ABIS, Advanced Brain Investigation Squad, and they mainly investigate crimes through a process called syncing, which is spelt with a P-S-Y, because it's to do with psychic stuff and the brain and stuff like that. Bizarrely, that aspect of it reminds me of another anime and manga series called Himitsu Top Secret, which is also about investigating murders using the brain. It is a really interesting series, so if you get a chance, check it out. Anyway, the game starts with Kaname, who lost his left eye and his memory 6 years prior. He's called to investigate the murder of a young lady who has been killed and her left eye has been removed. Her daughter was at the scene, she's unable to speak, so the way they have to find out what happened is to dive into her dreams. And this is where the game kind of splits into its second part, because the first part is investigation, second part is the Somnium part. And the artificial intelligence that lives in your eye, called Iba, yes, they did call it Iba. Even I am shuddering at the pun there. Iba has to navigate through the dreamscapes of the witnesses to these murders in order to discover the truth of what happened. And I think it's one of those interesting ideas that kind of parallels nicely with this whole idea of existing in two worlds at the same time. Because you effectively have two characters in one body, and both of them have two different jobs. And while it may seem a bit of a bizarre choice that you could play alongside or even instead of the Medium, I think either Somnium Files has a lot to offer the right sort of players. It might be that the Medium isn't your type of game, but you want something that is kind of along the same lines, but not as much horror-based. And I think either Somnium Files is a game that might appeal to you. You never know. So that's my first choice. Moving on, we go back into the more traditional horror setting. Well, Japanese horror setting, I should say, with a franchise that I adore called Fatal Frame. Now, I'm not going with the second game this time, and regular listeners, regular viewers will know how much of a fan I am of the second game. Nope, instead I'm going with the sequel to the second game, and yes, it is a sequel to the second game. I'm going with Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented. Some of you might be scratching your head a little bit as to why I've gone with a Fatal Frame game. Because the camera obscura is pretty famous now. You know, you attack ghosts with your camera, trap the souls of the dead, yada yada yada. But hear me out on this. Because in Fatal Frame 3, you take on the role of a 23-year-old freelance photographer called Rei Kurosawa. She's been mourning the death of her fiancé, who died in a car accident caused by her reckless driving, so she is, pardon the phrasing, tormented by guilt. About 2 months after his death, she's on assignment at the derelict Kuze mansion, and she discovers an image of herself in one of the photos she's taken, and she's confused by this. After that, things get weird, because in her dreams, she discovers there is an old Japanese manor house called the Manor of Sleep, and this is where the game kind of separates into two. You have the daylight hours and the nighttime hours. And in the daylight hours, Rei is moving around doing things in the real world, but in the nighttime hours, she's moving around the Manor of Sleep. And after a certain point, the dream world starts invading the working world. The whole idea of Fatal Frame 3 parallels really nicely with the whole concept of the Medium, because Rei has to figure out what the hell's going on, what is the Manor of Sleep, why is it affecting her in particular, things like that. And in the same way, Marianne has to figure out what's going on in the hotel in Krakow. She has to figure out what happened and why it's affecting her in particular. I think Fatal Frame 3 and The Medium are games that you can play maybe one after the other, depending on which order you want to play them in. I think they do parallel really, really nicely. Moving on to my third choice. This one's more of a punt. See, one of the things that struck me about The Medium is the whole idea of perceptual reality, which I'm not going to go into. It's a very long and complicated subject. Suffice to say that Marianne's ability to exist in two planes at the same time, I've always been fascinated by things like that. But it suddenly struck me that if you weren't aware of your abilities, if you didn't know what they were, and you were growing up with these abilities as a medium, you would suffer from all sorts of mental health issues. Your perception of the world would be changing all of the time. And I thought, is there a game like that? And yes, there is. It's Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. I know it's a bit of a stretch for some people, but in a very strange way, Hellblade and the character Senua I could very easily imagine that's kind of what Marianne would have been like when she was growing up, and especially maybe during her teenage years, when she's not sure what's happening. Why can she see spirits? What's going on? Is she going mad? Is she schizophrenic? Why can she hear voices? Do you see where I'm going with this? When people don't understand exactly what powers are available to a particular person. And one of the great things about Ninja Theory's Hellblade is that it plays around with this whole idea of perceptual reality. I mean, there's those gate things that you can go through which change your perspective and your perception of what's actually there. There's the character of Senua herself, who basically goes on this journey to rescue the soul of her dead fiancé, her dead lover. The game itself is a psychological horror. Okay, it might be a bit more action-oriented than The Medium. I mean, The Medium is more of a puzzle-solving psychological horror game, whereas Hellblade, it does have puzzle-solving in there, but it also has a lot of hack-and-slash action. I think Hellblade is a game that you could very easily play before you play The Medium. And I think that in a very bizarre way, I think Hellblade makes a nice kind of introduction to The Medium. I'm not sure if I'm making enough sense when I try and explain this, because it involves a dive into hell, it involves fighting fiery demon, Viking, zombie things. It involves aspects of death and various things like that, just like The Medium does. It involves Senua interacting with spirits and things from other planes, just like The Medium does. I could very easily see Hellblade and The Medium sitting side by side on a shelf. They kind of work together, at least in my head they do. Anyway, I think that the two games really do complement each other quite well. And I think if you're going to kind of go with a little trilogy of games that might not seem interconnected, but in a very bizarre way they are, then you could also throw Fatal Frame 3 into the mix as well. Those are my choices, so The Somnium Files, Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented, and Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. Let us know what your alternatives to The Medium are, as our choices are by no means definitive. If you liked the video, then give us a thumb, a sub, or a bell, and if you want to support us, then check out our Patreon, the details are in the description. If you're after more video game chit-chat, then subscribe and join us every Thursday for Impossible Mission. That's all for this episode. I'll be back next time with some alternatives to Little Nightmares 2, so look forward to that. Until then, thanks for watching.
All these people, they weren't just killed. Their spirits were ripped apart, broken beyond repair.